For more than 2,000 years, humanity has wrestled with profound questions about the nature of our world, our purpose, and the divine plan. These questions often lead us to seek answers through faith, politics, and history, but few topics have stirred the hearts of people, both spiritually and politically, as much as the mystery surrounding the Third Temple of Jerusalem. This temple is not just a building, it represents the intersection of prophecy, power, and the eternal covenant between God and His people. The prophecies of the Bible speak clearly of a time when the Third Temple will stand once more, an act that will undoubtedly alter the course of history. Yet, we ask ourselves who will be the leader bold enough to undertake this monumental task. In the modern geopolitical landscape, where Jews, Muslims, and Christians alike lay claim to Jerusalem's sacred ground, the rebuilding of this temple stands as a divine test of faith and diplomacy. Will it bring peace, a miraculous union between ancient faiths? Or will it ignite further conflict, shaking the foundations of the fragile peace we hold today? The great prophets, from Isaiah to Daniel, foretold of a time when Jerusalem would once again shine as the center of God's kingdom on earth. But they also warned of trials of a world divided by political and religious turmoil, where leaders will rise, deceiving many with promises of peace, only to bring chaos. The Antichrist, as foretold in the scriptures, will be welcomed by many in his attempts to resolve these tensions, but his reign will ultimately desecrate what is sacred. As believers, we must recognize that God's hand is at work, even in the midst of global uncertainty. He is sovereign, guiding every event towards His ultimate plan of redemption. The rebuilding of the Third Temple, as controversial and politically charged as it may be, is a sign of His eternal promise to Israel and to all who call upon His name. It is not merely a political or historical event, it is a fulfillment of prophecy, a call for us to trust in God's timing and wisdom. Dear listener, let us not approach these mysteries with fear, but with faith. The questions of who, when, and how the Third Temple will be rebuilt are secondary to the truth that God remains in control. Just as He guided His people through the wilderness and brought them back to their land, He will complete His work in Jerusalem. Whether this temple brings peace or conflict, we are called to witness and trust in His divine will. History is not just a series of political events, it is a tapestry woven by the Creator, leading us toward the ultimate revelation of His kingdom. Stand firm in faith, for the prophecies of the Bible are unfolding before our very eyes. Before we continue this journey, don't forget to subscribe and stay updated as we explore the complexities of prophecy, politics, and divine truth that shape our world today. The significance of the temple in Jewish history transcends its mere physical structure. It is the very heartbeat of Israel's spiritual identity, a symbol of the divine relationship between God and His chosen people. From the days of King Solomon, the temple was not just a place of ritual sacrifice but a beacon of hope, unity, and divine presence. Here, at the heart of Jerusalem, stood the center of Jewish worship, a sacred space where heaven touched earth, and where the covenant between God and Israel was renewed in every prayer and offering. The destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD marked a seismic shift not just politically, but spiritually for the Jewish people. The longing for its reconstruction has been woven into their identity, a reminder of the enduring covenant that God made with them. Even in times of great suffering and exile, this covenant has been unbroken. For centuries, Jews have looked towards the rebuilding of the temple as the ultimate sign of redemption, the fulfillment of God's promises in the prophecies of Isaiah, Daniel, and Ezekiel. But this is not merely a religious longing, it is deeply political. The Third Temple is intertwined with the future of Israel, a flashpoint of geopolitical tension, where the forces of faith, history, and politics collide. Leaders around the world understand that any movement towards its reconstruction could reshape the balance of power in the Middle East. Yet, this very possibility brings us back to the profound truth of God's sovereignty over history. It reminds us that no political leader, no earthly power, can thwart the plans of the Almighty. The prophets spoke of a time when the temple would rise again, not just as a physical structure but as a testament to God's enduring presence among His people. The third temple, when it comes, will not only fulfill ancient prophecies but will serve as a catalyst for the unfolding of events foretold in the Bible concerning the end of days. God's hand is at work in history, guiding nations and shaping the destinies of people. The rebuilding of the temple is not simply an architectural feat, it is the visible manifestation of God's promise, His faithfulness, and His ultimate plan for humanity. To fully grasp the profound significance of the Third Temple, we must first reflect on the historical and spiritual legacy of the first two temples, which hold central importance in Jewish tradition and biblical prophecy. The first temple, known as Solomon's Temple, was constructed around 957 BC. In Jerusalem, this sacred place was not just a center for worship, but a physical manifestation of God's covenant with His people. For nearly 400 years, it stood as a symbol of unity, faith, and the presence of the Almighty, until its destruction by the Babylonians under King Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC. This catastrophe ushered in the Babylonian exile, a time of immense suffering and reflection for the Jewish people. Yet, even in this dark hour, their faith remained steadfast. Through God's grace, the promise of restoration was fulfilled. After 70 years, God's chosen people returned to rebuild the temple, as recorded in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. The Second Temple, later expanded by King Herod, was the spiritual heart of Israel during the time of Jesus Christ. It was within its sacred walls that Jesus taught, healed, and proclaimed His mission, forever intertwining the history of this temple with the story of Christianity. But in 70 AD, once again, tragedy struck. The Romans destroyed the temple, leaving only the western wall as a reminder of its former glory. This marked the beginning of a long exile for the Jewish people, a dispersion that continues to shape their identity today. The Temple Mount, where these two magnificent temples once stood, remains one of the most contentious pieces of land in the world, a battleground not only of faith but also of politics. Today, it houses the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, two of the holiest sites in Islam. For Jews, it is believed to be the location of the Holy of Holies, where God's presence once dwelled. This shared reverence for the land underscores both the spiritual and geopolitical tensions that surround any discussion of a potential Third Temple. The Bible tells us that the rebuilding of the Third Temple is intertwined with the unfolding of God's divine plan, especially in relation to the end times. But we must acknowledge that such an act carries profound political and religious implications. Muslims view the Dome of the Rock as the site where the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven during the Isra and Mi'raj, and Jews revere the site as the place where Abraham was prepared to sacrifice Isaac. The destruction or alteration of this sacred space could spark not just theological debates, but significant global conflict. The sovereignty of Jerusalem has been contested for decades, particularly between Israel and Palestine. The significance of the Temple Mount, or Haram al-Sharif in Islam, transcends politics. It is sacred ground for billions of people. Under international law, East Jerusalem is considered occupied territory since Israel's victory in the Six-Day War of 1967. Attempts to shift this balance could ignite a firestorm of conflict, not only in the region but globally. Prophets have foretold the strife surrounding Jerusalem in the last days, yet in every trial, we are reminded of God's hand at work, shaping nations and destinies. Israel, too, understands the gravity of this situation. While some within the government and religious circles push for the rebuilding of the temple as a fulfillment of prophecy, Israeli leaders are acutely aware of the broader implications. Rebuilding the temple on such a contested site could trigger not just a local conflict but an international crisis, threatening peace accords with neighboring nations like Egypt and Jordan, and causing ripple effects throughout the Middle East. The delicate alliances with global powers such as the United States and the European Union could also be jeopardized, destabilizing what is already a fragile peace. However, despite these political complexities, we must not lose sight of the larger truth: God's purpose will prevail. The prophets foretold that the nations would gather against Jerusalem, yet the city will remain at the center of God's plan for the world. We are witnessing prophecy unfold, but we must also remember that the battle is the Lord's. Political leaders may seek to maintain the status quo, fearing the consequences of escalation, but no human strategy can stand against God's divine will. As we reflect on these events, we are reminded of God's sovereignty. The challenges facing Jerusalem, the Third Temple, and the future of this holy city are part of a greater story, one written long before our time. It is a story that calls for faith, patience, and unwavering trust in God's plan. As the prophet Isaiah declared, "The Lord Almighty has purposed, and who can thwart him?" Isaiah 14 verse 27. In every conflict, God is working out his will, and his promise to restore his people will come to pass. Who does Jerusalem really belong to? The question of Jerusalem's ownership is not merely a political or historical one, it is deeply spiritual and prophetic, anchored in the covenant between God and his chosen people. According to the Bible, Jerusalem is not just a piece of land, but the city destined for divine purposes. It is the heart of God's promise to Israel, a city whose spiritual significance transcends borders and earthly conflicts. Jerusalem is the city where God established his covenant with King David. It was here, in the heart of the ancient city, that David's military conquests became acts of divine fulfillment. As the Bible recounts in 2 Samuel 5 verse 6-9, David's victory over the Jebusites and his establishment of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel was more than a political maneuver, it was the unfolding of God's divine plan. David's reign was a physical representation of God's enduring promise to Israel, and Jerusalem, the city of David, became the nerve center of this covenant. But God's promise didn't end with David. It expanded through Solomon, David's son, who constructed the first temple, a monumental act that solidified Jerusalem as the spiritual heartbeat of the Jewish people. It wasn't just a place of worship, it was the physical manifestation of God's dwelling among his people. Jerusalem is not just an ancient city, it is the prophesied epicenter of God's kingdom on earth. In Zechariah 8 verse 3, God declares, "I have restored Zion, and I will dwell in the midst of Jerusalem, and Jerusalem shall be called the city of truth." This prophetic promise is not limited to the past but stretches into the future, where Jerusalem plays a pivotal role in God's divine plan for humanity. As we move closer to the fulfillment of these prophecies, we are reminded that Jerusalem stands as a beacon of God's enduring faithfulness. In Isaiah 2 verse 2-3, the Bible foretells that in the last days, the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established at the top of the mountains, and all nations shall flow to it. This is no ordinary city, it is the future throne of Christ, where justice and peace will reign. Jerusalem's future, therefore, is not just about who controls it politically, it is about God's eternal kingdom and his plan to restore what has been broken. The significance of Jerusalem is most evident in the Temple Mount, the sacred ground where God's presence was believed to dwell. As Deuteronomy 12 verse 5 states, "But the place which the Lord your God chooses for his dwelling, that you shall seek, and there you shall go." This holy site is more than just a geographical location, it is the spiritual axis of Jewish worship and divine presence. The Temple Mount symbolizes God's promise to his people, where the ancient sacrifices took place, and where the Jewish community connected directly with the divine. The longing for the Third Temple is a yearning for the restoration of this intimate connection with God. The promise of the eternal kingdom is not just about rebuilding Jerusalem, it's about the fulfillment of God's divine plan for humanity. As described in Isaiah 2 verse 2-3, this future kingdom will be centered in Jerusalem, where Christ will rule during the millennial reign. It will be a time when all nations flow to Jerusalem, and the word of God will go forth from the city. The rebuilding of the Third Temple is not simply a religious or political act, but a part of God's redemptive work in history. Today, debates about the Third Temple continue, but they transcend politics and religious zeal. Orthodox rabbis await the Messiah for the temple's reconstruction, while the temple movement actively prepares for it, demonstrating a belief that God's promises are imminent. The preparation of sacred utensils and training of priests reflects a return to sacred traditions, fulfilling prophecy and building hope. Jerusalem's significance goes beyond its geopolitical importance. It is God's chosen city, where His ultimate plan for the world will manifest. The third temple is both a beacon of hope and a sign of coming tribulation. Prophecy warns us of the Antichrist, who will broker a false peace, allowing the temple's reconstruction but leading to the abomination of desolation, as foretold in Daniel 9 verse 27 and Matthew 24 verse 15. In this final chapter of human history, we are reminded that true peace can only come from God's sovereignty, not human treaties. As nations vie for control over Jerusalem, we must place our trust in God's unshakable promises, knowing His divine plan will prevail despite the world's upheavals. God is in control, and His word will be fulfilled with precision. In Revelation 11 verse 1-2, we see John instructed to measure the temple of God, symbolizing God's ownership and protection over what is sacred. This act reflects a deeper meaning: God's sovereignty over His chosen people and His promise to restore what was lost. The outer court, left to be trampled by the Gentiles for 42 months, signifies the ongoing tension between holy and profane forces throughout history. The destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD marked the beginning of the times of the Gentiles, where Jerusalem and the Jewish people faced domination by foreign powers. This period is a key prophecy in Luke 21 verse 24, where Jesus foretold Jerusalem being trampled until the appointed time. While Israel was reborn in 1948 and regained some of its land, Jerusalem remains divided, highlighting the unfinished prophecy. However, the growing preparations for the Third Temple, including the creation of sacred items and the training of priests, are signs of hope. This preparation aligns with Daniel's prophecy, which speaks of a final period of tribulation, signaling that God's ultimate plan is unfolding. The 1,260 days mentioned in Revelation reflect a time of trial and divine intervention, where God's witnesses will minister in the face of rising evil. This period, while challenging, is necessary for the return of Christ and the restoration of God's kingdom. God's message in this prophecy is clear: He has not abandoned His people. Even as political tensions and spiritual battles continue, these events are part of the divine plan, leading us toward a time of ultimate restoration and victory. We must remain steadfast in our faith, trusting that God's promises are being fulfilled and that the kingdom of God will soon be fully realized.